Everyone, thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. As I think you all know, these are interesting times, to say the least, in Washington, D.C. And I think our hope is to help unpack some of the conversations that are happening here around the budget, around the deficit, around the debt ceiling, and also around the Farm Bill, and figure out how we as stateful advocates can engage in this conversation and to equip you to engage both in your local communities and here in Washington, D.C. Joining us as presenters today, we will begin with opening prayer by Rabbi Petowski. And following that, we will have presentations by Leslie Woods, the Presbyterian Church USA, and Amelia Keegan, who is with Bread for the World. We will also hear from Christine Ashley from Bread for the World, and we'll wrap up today with an action step and opportunities for engagement with Howie Levine, the Religious Action Center. I want to start out by thanking the Religious Action Center for hosting today's webinar, and this is sponsored by the Interreligious Working Group on Domestic Human Needs, which is a group of policy folks here in Washington, D.C. from a variety of faith organizations. One quick logistical note before we get started with our prayer. If you have questions, you should see in the corner of your screen a questions box. If you could please type your questions there. We will do our best to answer those questions in real time. At the end of our presentations, we'll also have a time to lift up some of those common threads and common questions for discussion among the panelists. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Petowski to open us with a word of prayer.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank the Interreligious Working Group and the RAC for really bringing this wonderful group together. I'm a conservative rabbi from Teaneck, New Jersey. I'm a member of the Government Affairs and Public Policy Committee for Mazon, a Jewish response to hunger. I want to speak with us and really share a text from our collective tradition from the book of Deuteronomy. At the beginning of chapter 15, we read two verses that speak about poverty, that speak about the need to notice those who so easily go unnoticed in our community. The first is chapter 15, verse 4, where the Bible teaches us, "There shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion." And then just 3 verses later, we read the following: "If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman." The rabbis of the Jewish tradition, they ask a very logical question: how can it be that the Bible teaches there will be no needy, and then just 3 verses later says, if, however, there are needy, this is what you should do? And they answer their own question, as they usually do, by saying the verse that teaches there will be no needy, that is the ideal. That is the dream we are all working toward. But, however, until we reach that dream, we have to deal with the world we live in, with the reality that so often lets us down, but inspires us still. And that reality teaches us to not harden our hearts and to open our hands to the needy. So we engage in holy work in everything that we do when we try to help those who have no voice, when we seek to support those who have no one else to support them. We engage in God's work and in holy work to repair the broken pieces of our world that God left us to repair. I would love to say that the dream of Deuteronomy 15:4, where there will be no needy, is just around the corner. But I think it's a little bit farther away than that. But each one of us has a job to do. Right? Our job is to work as hard as we can to bring that world into our world, to have our world become that dream. I look forward to hearing practical ideas, to be inspired by all of the incredible work done by the presenters on this call, by everyone who is participating, and I really look forward to sharing that dream with all of you. Thank you, and Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi, so much for that opening reflection, and I too hope that that dream is not all that far away, and I firmly believe that it is possible, which makes it all the more something that we should be reaching for in our communities, both local and national. Let me introduce myself. My name is Leslie Woods. I serve the Presbyterian Church USA Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. I'm the representative for domestic poverty and environmental issues. And I am going to start off, well, first of all, I'll apologize in advance for those of you who have been following this closely and for whom some of what I will say will be a repeat or kind of a back to basics. But not knowing who all would be on the webinar, I thought it would be helpful to start kind of at the beginning, so to speak. So the first thing I'd like to say when describing where we are right now in our national dialogue is, I think, a very important piece that seems to be getting lost in the mainstream media, and that is that the current budget crisis was completely avoidable. And what is that crisis? Well, it's two main things, and then a number of smaller things that create significant problems, but I'm going to stick to my two main things. We're going to focus on the first two. So we have a government shutdown and a fast approaching deadline to increase the debt ceiling. We also have a number of important pieces of legislation that have expired. Oh, I beg your pardon. The most important of which is the Farm Bill, about which you'll hear more from Christine in a little while. And obviously, there are other important pieces of legislation that expired at the end of September 30th, including temporary assistance for needy families and the Ryan White Care Act, a number of very important pieces of legislation that authorize important services that people rely on. So all of those things kind of get wrapped in together into a situation that is really quite dire for particularly low-income people. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes unpacking the shutdown and the debt ceiling a touch. But first, I want to provide a little, even more context. Just a reminder that before this shutdown happened, domestic programs across the government had already been cut pretty deeply as a result of the sequester, which were those across-the-board budget cuts that were the result of the last time we had a congressional standoff over the debt ceiling in 2011. So even before the government shut down, which has closed offices that provide services and enroll new participants in programs that alleviate poverty, those programs had already had to cut back, already had to reduce costs, cut beneficiaries, whatever it was that those programs did to meet that budget cut. And I will say that well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I do think it's important that the current debate over what funding will open the government back up again is at current year levels, which means that already those funding levels according to our convictions and our advocacy, are too low, that these budget cuts are unacceptable. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'll pull back. If the sequester is not replaced by something else and continues into the next fiscal year, domestic programs will be cut by nearly 18%. And that really is catastrophic for some programs. Next slide, please. So that's the context. So now we come to the shutdown itself. The reason for the shutdown is a congressional failure to act. Each year, Congress must pass spending bills for a new fiscal year, and that starts on October 1. Right now, we are waiting on funding for fiscal year 2014. So 2014 starts in October of 2013 and goes to September 30th, 2014. Without a spending bill, the parts of the government that rely on annual appropriations, so annual spending bills, must shut down even though essential services and workers remain on the job, even though they're not being paid. So these programs range very widely from programs that serve the most vulnerable people, like the Women, Infants, and Children's Nutrition Program and Head Start, to other important functions of government like the national parks and medical research and food and drug inspections and tracking contagious diseases. And I mean, the list is long, and the government agencies are sometimes relatively invisible in the good order and functioning of the community. Next slide, please. Why are these important services shut down? Well, I'm going to leave the political analysis to Amelia Keegan in a few minutes, but the short story is that Congress failed to pass a short-term continuing resolution that would have kept the government up and running while a longer-term spending deal was negotiated through the fall months. So doing something short was supposed to be easy, and it was supposed to buy time. And that's why also people weren't quibbling over the spending levels and how low they are, because it was supposed to be a short-term thing. It was only going to be a month or two, and the longer-term negotiations were where people had put hopes in repairing some of the damage done by some of the damaging spending cuts. Well, why did they fail to pass a continuing resolution, what I'll refer to as a CR? So on September 20th, the House passed a CR that continued current spending levels, so that's, as I say, FY13 post-sequester levels until December 15th. This bill also included a provision to defund portions of the Affordable Care Act, which is more commonly known as Obamacare. The next week, after some lengthy debate and some political theater, the Senate rejected the House bill, stripped it of the ACA provisions, shortened the time frame to end on November 15th, so a month shorter, and then they sent it back. They passed what's being referred to as a clean CR, that is, it was free from policy riders about healthcare or anything else. So they sent it back to the House. And that was on the Friday before the Tuesday, October 1st deadline. And then on October 1, the federal government shutdown began. And during the week since, the House has started to take up a piecemeal approach to fund popular programs, but it hasn't taken a vote on the Senate's clean bill, which several news sources have estimated would pass if it came to the floor. So I thought that this little cartoon, while a little edgy, I think, at least for me, nicely illustrates what seems to be going on. This debate is not actually about the spending bill. And in fact, no one, as I say, is arguing about how much money should be included in this short-term bill, even though many would like to see some of the cuts restored. So this seems to me to be a power play, and as the cartoon says, it's just to make a point. Next slide. So what is this point costing us? The federal government has been shut down for just over a week, and based on news reports, polls, and anecdotal evidence, the public does not like it. Many of the services that the most vulnerable people rely on are dipping into contingency funds that will not continue to function if the shutdown lasts much longer. Still others are just plain frozen. And then there is also the economic impact of a shutdown, separate from the suffering due to closed and reduced services like Head Start. Bloomberg's numbers yesterday estimated $160 million per day in lost economic activity during the shutdown. And today, the total cost would top $2 billion. And when I say lost economic activity, we're not talking about investors on Wall Street, though impacts are starting to be felt there. But actually, I'm talking about Main Street. I'm talking about 800,000 federal workers who are furloughed and hundreds of thousands more who are working without pay, many of whom are low wage and live paycheck to paycheck. Also, the restaurant workers who cater to those working at or doing business with the government, all the businesses that serve the tourists at national parks and historic sites, the hotels, coffee shops, retailers, all are affected by the uncertainty and the pay stoppage, and many will not be able to recoup those lost revenues even when the government does open back up. And of course, there also is the psychological and healthcare costs associated with the increased stress and unpredictability of the current situation. This thing is costing an awful lot, both in dollars and in human well-being. And what have we in the faith community said about this? Well, on Friday, before the deadline, a group of 34 religious leaders wrote to Congress, and they said, though Congress must pass a federal budget, it belongs to every American. But this common fund, formed of our combined tax revenues, is designed to support the shared infrastructure, well-being, and long-term ethical values of our society. As people of faith, we find it morally irresponsible to blockade the process by which we provide for our nation's shared needs in a bid to force any individual legislative priority. Needless to say, we think the damage is too great. So that was the first problem. Moving on to problem number 2. The debt ceiling is quickly becoming inextricably linked to the government shutdown and the economic crisis that seems will ensue. The U.S. debt ceiling is exactly what it sounds like. The point at which the Treasury no longer has the authority to borrow money in order to pay its bills. Treasury has already been taking extraordinary measures since May to avoid default on the debt. And Treasury has estimated that those extraordinary measures will run out on October 17th. An increased debt ceiling does not mean that we are spending more. It means that we are ensuring enough cash flow to meet the already approved commitments of the U.S. government, payments this and previous Congresses authorized. So why does the debt ceiling matter to you and me? When the Treasury cannot borrow money, the business of government will slowly grind to a halt as the daily revenue is not ample to meet daily expenses. And it will be more serious than the shutdown, where many important programs like Social Security, Medicaid, and SNAP, which is formerly the food stamp program, under a shutdown, those programs continue regardless of annual appropriations. But if we default on the debt, those payments could stop. The checks may not be cut, or they may bounce. A default on the debt would also likely mean another economic crisis as the financial markets react to the unprecedented U.S. default. Just the threat of default 2 years ago sent the market into a flurry and cost the U.S. its AAA credit rating. And what's very strange about the debate over the debt ceiling is that no one other than a minority of members of Congress actually want it. The business community certainly doesn't want it. The Chamber of Commerce and lobbyists for banks have been all over the Hill urging Congress not to play with fire. Advocates for human needs programs, faith advocates, environmental advocates, foreign heads of state, all are urging Congress to increase the debt ceiling. And what have the faith advocates said? Well, in the same letter I quoted earlier, they wrote it would be reckless to propel the United States into financial default by refusing to raise the debt ceiling for spending that Congress has already approved. Shuttering the federal government or defaulting on the nation's financial commitments is likely to reverse our fragile economic recovery, punish the middle class, and deeply harm our most vulnerable neighbors. Our democracy rests on principles of reason, compromise, and a commitment to the common good. To hold our governance processes and financial credibility hostage to narrow priorities is not only dangerous to the nation's near-term financial well-being, it threatens the very foundations of our democratic process and our capacity to live united in community. So this is just to lighten the mood a little bit. I really liked this cartoon. Uncle Sam beating his head against the wall as the debt ceiling rests on the heads of Congress. It certainly is how I've been feeling in the last week. Next slide, please. And what about all of this rhetoric about negotiating and not negotiating? Who's negotiating? Who's not negotiating? He said, she said. The truth is that regardless of the rhetoric, both sides of the aisle will have to come to a negotiating table in good faith. But the problem is that currently the end game is about politics, not about funding the government or about helping people. So while we can't change that political calculus, we can remind them loud and clear over and over that the job of Congress is to govern and to do so with compassion and humility. We know from recent census data releases that there is a serious poverty problem in this country, which is not figuring into any political conversations right now, but it must, and Congress needs to hear from us. So now I'll let Amelia jump in and do some of the political calculations and expectations.
Thank you, Leslie. So if we go to the first slide here, so what exactly is the problem and how did we get into this situation? I think one of the things, there are kind of three pieces that I really see here. The first is just the way in which the congressional districts are drawn is that, and the way that we're seeing elections these days, is that actually many members are acting in a way that is aligned with what their constituents want. And you will hear, particularly on the House of Representatives, members of Congress saying, I am hearing loud and clear from my constituents to stay firm and continue the track that I'm taking. And so I think in that respect, whereas the entire polls may show that the entirety of the country may be believing one thing or another, when you look at those individual districts, many of those members are behaving in ways that are consistent with what their constituents are saying. Secondly, the fact is, because of the way in which we've seen a lot of these districts drawn, is that now many of the most contentious elections are actually not happening at the general level, not happening during the general election. It's during the primaries. And so a number of members are very scared about primary challenges and therefore are tacking more to the right and more reluctant to come out with more moderate positions, particularly on budget issues. And then the third thing is that we are seeing, particularly in the House, some really strong divisions, and which is making it very difficult for leadership to find a path forward, maintaining the unity of the caucus, which is what the House leadership has been trying to do. So if we go on to the next slide, what is really at issue here? As Leslie was saying, okay, the government is shut down right now because they have failed to pass a spending bill. But they have failed to pass a spending bill not because the spending is at issue, not because they can't agree on how much to spend. There was, and I mean, both parties really negotiated a short-term number, which, as Leslie highlighted, is pretty much continued sequestration. So it's a tough number, but it was only supposed to be a short-term sort of agreement, so that a stopgap measure, so that Congress really could come to the table and negotiate on some of the larger budget issues. How do you fund the government and all federal programs for the rest of the fiscal year? How do you address sequestration and kind of get some agreement on those larger budget issues? But since then, it has really gotten snagged, and now we're in this government shutdown over this short-term, what many of us thought was already negotiated and agreed to spending bill. So really the goal of, as we were saying, of that short-term measure, of this short-term continuing resolution, is to get to a bigger deal. It's to be able to get to negotiations on the larger budget issues, but they can't even get to that because of this current impasse. Third thing is, a lot of both sides is kind of locked in their trying, and some members are really trying to find a way out, but they're having a really difficult time doing so. And I was in a meeting the other day where someone mentioned it's like the dog has been chasing the car, has finally caught the car, and now doesn't really know what to do. And then finally, taxes and revenues. I think that's always has been a sticking point. It's why Congress is, in kind of my view, why we haven't been able to see agreement on some of the larger budget issues. When trying to find a way to address sequestration, Republicans are saying, well, we're not going to agree to a dime in new revenues, and then Democrats say, okay, fine, if no revenues are on the table, then we're not going to agree to any more mandatory cuts, and what you're left with then is just the continuation of sequestration. So if we go on, what is each side saying here? The first thing to know is that the House and Senate are still in session, although they don't really have most of the offices don't really have any staff. But they're continuing to try and pass legislation and pass bills, but they're sending over bills that are not going to go anywhere. So the House continues to kind of pass different measures to fund parts of the government or fund the government, but it always included with provisions that they know that the Senate will find unacceptable. And so they're just passing stuff over to the Senate. Senate, it's not going to go anywhere. The Senate, we'll see, I think, is going to try and hold some votes today as well, but that's not going to go anywhere in the House. And one of the big problems is that neither side is really talking to each other. There are no negotiations going on. The White House and Democratic leadership is saying, we'll negotiate on the bigger budget issues, but we're not going to let anyone hold the economy hostage or threaten default to the United States. And therefore, keeping the government, if you hear them, they'll be saying, keeping the government running and enabling the country to pay its bills is not a concession. Whereas if you talk to members on the other side of the aisle, particularly House Republicans, many of them will say, listen, we want to get something in return for passing a measure, and we want to be able to negotiate that, and therefore there's no one sitting down at the other end of the table to negotiate with us. What is really scary, and why I've kind of put this Cuban Missile Crisis picture up there, is that both sides, many of them, if you talk to them, they will say, we're right on this. We're in the right on this. And you know what? It's the other side that's in an untenable position. And I believe that the public's with me on this. And you know what? The fact that the other side, they can't continue their hard line for much longer. So if both sides are saying that, it puts us in a very scary and dangerous spot. It is interesting that Senator McCain did go speak on the floor yesterday, and say that he's, kind of urging some colleagues to back off a bit. You do have some moderates in the House of Representatives who have been saying, listen, we need to just get through this, open the government, and get onto some negotiations on the larger budget issues. But as of now, there's not a lot of conversation going on between the parties, and it seems to be a real stalemate. So going on to the next slide, and I mean, I really do want to highlight what Leslie said, and emphasize what Leslie said, is that, all right, there is a lot of media attention going on about this issue, right? And there's a lot of rhetoric going on about what's happening in Congress, what's happening with the White House, what's happening with the shutdown and with the debt ceiling. But we come at these issues as members of the faith community through the lens of talking about how the budget is a moral document, how it outlines the priorities of our country. We look at these issues through the lens of how these policies will impact the most vulnerable. And as Leslie said, those voices and that lens is not what is being talked about in the halls of Congress. It's not what's being talked about in the media. And the fact of the matter is that the shutdown, when you're talking about cuts to WIC benefits, when you're talking about people not being able to access their food stamp or SNAP benefits because of the shutdown, when you're talking about a shutdown and a potential default that could have huge economic consequences that are going to impact the most those who are really struggling in hunger and with poverty, that is nowhere in those conversations. And those are going to be some of the most extreme consequences. So that's our job, right? To encourage policymakers to resolve these issues in a responsible way, in a way that is best for the economy, but also in a way that prioritizes those who are living at the economic margins of our country. So with that, I will shift it over to Leslie to give us the forecast of how this is all going to end.
Thanks, Amelia. So we're playing a bit of hot potato in the room here. And I'm going to get out my crystal ball. So you have to imagine me as Professor Trelawney. And if you got the Harry Potter reference, congratulations. I'm gonna give you my best guesses. Well, no, I'm not. I'm going to give you some guesses for how this thing might end. Next slide, please. But the real problem is that no one actually knows how it will end. Not members of Congress, not the president, and certainly not me. But I'll give it a shot. What I do think is clear is that these two big problems, the shutdown and the debt ceiling, will end up wrapped into one final package. And for this reason, I think the shutdown will go on for at least another week, if not longer. Next slide. We know that Congress has no idea based on various members' comments to the media. Plus, in an age where transparency is the name of the game, there really is no opportunity for delicate negotiations without both sides getting wind of a deal and crying betrayal. So it's delicate. And no one quite knows how long it's going to take to get to the center, to get to the Tootsie Roll in the middle of the Tootsie Pop. No one knows. Next slide, please. There are a few obvious possible ways forward, but again, this is a guess. One motion in the works is, it's honestly kind of a long shot, but the House Democrats are moving what's called a discharge petition that would require a House vote on the Senate's clean continuing resolution. A discharge petition is the only way to move legislation in the House without the Speaker's consent, but it requires a majority of members in the chamber to sign it. And that would mean, because it's a so the way the party division falls out in the House, it would mean that several Republicans would have to very publicly break with their party and cross the aisle to sign a discharge petition. So even if they were willing to vote for that clean CR if it came to the floor, they may not be willing to snub their nose at their leadership so completely. On the debt ceiling, the Senate is reportedly going to consider a clean debt ceiling increase by the end of this week. At least that's what they were saying this morning. And they may actually have the 60 votes they need to pass it. And if the Senate passes something on the debt ceiling before the House does, which I suppose is likely at this point, it may be the only game in town. So again, it may be a question of this is the only thing on the table. And if it really does come down to the wire and we really are about to default on the debt, that may be the best way forward. I would also imagine that if the Senate does pass a clean debt ceiling provision, I would imagine that the House would also start a discharge petition on it just to start the clock running and start trying to get those signatures. But I honestly think it's most likely that a deal will be worked out in a back room and that both sides will negotiate. I don't know which side will blink first, but what seems clear is that, this is no longer about the issues that it's ostensibly about. And in fact, it's fascinating that the original demands that went into starting this shutdown over the Affordable Care Act have essentially been abandoned. And so it's really hard to see what the end goal is. And at this point, both parties are trying to save face. Both parties want to be able to say that they won. And that's really not encouraging. But again, as Amelia said, I think what's incredibly important is that members of Congress be continually reminded that this shutdown and that the potential debt default will hurt people. It's not just an ideological thing. It's not, it's not something that exists only on paper. This is real and it is hurting people. It makes lives more difficult. It forces awful decisions on families. And so congressional decisions need to be grounded in a commitment to the common good and to good government. And that's what they need to continually hear from us and from our allies. So the faith community has been engaged in these conversations for decades, calling lawmakers to a responsible and compassionate budget conversation. In a document that we produce about once a year for a couple of years now, we wrote, the way to national recovery is not to close our hearts to the poor, but to heed the words of the prophet Isaiah, who assures us, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom be like the noonday. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to live in. And I think that that's so important. This call from the prophet Isaiah is about meeting immediate need right now, and it's also about investing in future generations and restoring relationships where they have become broken. So I know it's not a lot to go on as far as how this thing will be resolved. I wish there were more to offer. I wish I could tell you that a bill was coming to the floor tomorrow. But I think that the most important takeaway, and I know Howie will talk about this later, is to continue to call on Congress to resolve this quickly and compassionately.
So we can take to make all of this helpful information turn into impact. So there's 3 easy ways you can contact your senators and representatives. First, you can call. We have a toll-free number on the screen. It'll take you to the Capitol switchboard. They'll just simply ask you for your zip code, and you can request to talk to your representative or one of your senators. You can write a letter. As politicians are getting fewer and fewer physical letters these days, their impact has grown a little bit. And you can, as always, write an email. Most of the organizations on the call that have probably sent you to this webinar have kind of action centers online where you can put in your zip code and be directed to sending an email to your representatives and senators. So a few tips for any way you are contacting your senators and representatives. First, make it personal. Include any personal stories you might have, any information that has really spoke to you throughout this webinar, anything you've read in a newspaper, and include any sacred texts that are meaningful to you that you think are relevant. Because really they want to see a letter that's really your letter, not just something you pulled off the internet and they've gotten 50 of already. Make sure it has a clear ask in the letter. Make sure they know at the end of the letter exactly what you want them to do. We want you to protect the vulnerable by ending this shutdown and avoiding the debt ceiling. Simple but explicit. And as I touched on, use moral language. As members of the faith community, we can use some moral language that is more powerful than just "I urge you to." And as always, include your address just so they know you're a constituent. And beyond the personal ways for you to contact your own senators and representatives, there's ways for you to multiply your impact. So you can write a letter to the editor for your local newspaper. You can run an event in your community, whether that's at your church or synagogue, or partnering with other churches, synagogues, anti-poverty, anti-hunger organizations in your community. The more organizations you have sponsoring an event, the better. The more people will hear about it and hopefully contact their senators and representatives. And also talk with your friends and kind of compel them to act. Talk about why you felt compelled to contact your senators and representatives, and kind of hope they will too. Get the word out about these issues and how they're really negatively affecting the vulnerable in our country. So if you do that, make sure to let one of us know, whichever organization you're affiliated with, just because we can follow up, we can talk to that representative, we can call them and say, oh, did you see this great event that happened in your community? Or did you see the letter in your local paper to the editor that was backing one side on these issues? And that can really help us be more powerful here in Washington and help the impact of your event or your letter go farther. So now I think we're going to take some questions that if you have any, can we? So I think Christine is actually available on the line now, and she'll give us information on the Farm Bill and where that stands right now.
Hi, can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
We can hear you, Christine.
We can hear you.
Oh, great. Well, I'm not sure what happened there, but I'll try to make it through this Farm Bill piece pretty quickly. I know we haven't been able to do any questions yet. But if you've all been following along, not just the budget situation, but what's been going on with the Farm Bill, you'll know that they're working on one this year. The House and Senate both have to pass identical bills, and the Senate actually passed its bill in June. And as you'll see on the slide, they are all systems go. They are ready to move forward. And the Farm Bill, of course, includes a number of programs that are really important, not just to hungry and poor people, but to the religious community in general. The Senate bill that passed cut the SNAP program by about $4 billion, but it did also have some positive changes to international food aid and some other reforms in farm programs. And the Senate, like I said, is ready to move forward with the process and finish the Farm Bill. But in the House, which we move to the next slide, we have a completely different story. Just like all these budget debates have been going on, the Farm Bill has kind of been wrapped into all of that. And when people look at the Farm Bill, they look and they say, how can we get the most amount of savings possible? So the House first tried to pass a Farm Bill in July. They tried to cut about $20 billion from SNAP, and that attempt actually failed in the House, which was a surprise to a lot of people. And part of the reason that it failed was, you'll see there's a little graph here of a pie chart, and that's actually from the Heritage Foundation. They were pushing really hard to actually split the nutrition programs out of the Farm Bill because they think they're too big and they wanted to get it cut. A lot of folks were trying to get more savings out of nutrition programs. So they split the Farm Bill in half, and they passed a farm-only Farm Bill back in July, and that did not include any nutrition programs and actually would have made the new farm law that they passed permanent. What this meant for SNAP, or food stamps, as some people call them, is that it was the target for even larger cuts. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see that this September, the House tried step number 3 to cut SNAP, and they actually considered a bill that cut almost $40 billion from the program. This would have some pretty dramatic consequences. It would take 4 million people off the program. A number of over 200,000 children would lose access to free school meals. A number of other households would see their benefits reduced. And unfortunately, this bill passed despite all of our best efforts. But like Leslie said earlier, we're people of hope. And I'm trying to find the silver lining in this whole situation after working on this bill for some time. And the good news is that 15 Republicans actually voted against these deep cuts. And they didn't vote against them because they didn't think they were deep enough. They voted against them because they thought they were too deep. And I think that our advocacy and our efforts here had a lot to do with that. Thousands of phone calls and emails went up to the Hill, and we had a number of meetings here in D.C. and back home. Those letters to the editor, those were effective. And I think that this, while the bill might have passed, it was such a close vote that I think it just shows how strong our advocacy has been so far, and really just shows why we need to continue pushing on. So what happens now? If we go to the next slide, I think it's still kind of unclear what's going to happen. Theoretically, the House and Senate should be appointing what are called conferees, which are members of Congress from the House and Senate that will sit down and work together on a final farm bill that both chambers can agree to. So that might be happening. It's still kind of unclear. Like Leslie mentioned earlier, the current farm law expired on September 30th, and SNAP continues. A number of farm programs continue, but a lot of other small farm programs really don't, and those are the ones that are at risk moving forward. Like I said, it's still unclear how they're going to resolve the farm bill, but there's been rumors that maybe they'll just extend current law, which I think is kind of unlikely at this point and would be harmful to all the programs we care about. SNAP would probably be cut to fund other priorities, and that's something that we are really concerned about. And finally, we've heard rumors lately that the farm bill might even get rolled into the budget debate that's been happening that Leslie and Amelia were talking about. Like I said, the Farm Bill, both the House and the Senate passed farm bills that actually had a significant amount of savings. And so that very well could be pulled into those budget debates moving forward. And so we need to continue to be vigilant in our advocacy and our efforts to protect the programs that we really care about. So moving forward, if we go and look at the next slide, I think our message, we continue to push on. I think members of Congress are finally starting to hear it. And I think that if we stay strong, that we can protect the programs that are so vital. So I know it's 3:30, so I'm going to stop right there.
Great. Thanks, Christine, and thanks to all the presenters. I did want to make one quick housekeeping note. The most common question has been, when would the slides become available? And so following the end of this webinar, which is coming up real quickly, we will send around a link with both a recording of the webinar and the slides for folks who didn't get to write down all the information that they needed. I also wanted to lift up one quick question for the group. that I thought was, we've had a lot of questions coming in. We're trying to answer them in real time, so thanks for those questions. The question was really, what specific recommendations would our esteemed panelists have for how to engage in the budget negotiations once the continuing resolution and the debt ceiling fight is over? Presumably, there will be something that gets us reopened and past this hurdle, and that there will be some other larger conversation around the budget, and what can we as faithful advocates be doing to engage in that conversation?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's really, really important that members of Congress hear from all of you, particularly about the harmful effects of sequestration. If members of Congress are not getting pressure about how those cuts are really unsustainable, that will just get locked into the whatever is negotiated for the rest of the year. And whatever is negotiated for the rest of the year really does set precedent for sequestration continuing on beyond that. So I think it is absolutely critical that members of Congress hear from all of you that sequestration is unsustainable and that really it must be replaced with something much more balanced. And what we say at Bread for the World and what many of our groups say is that needs to be a combination of revenues and responsible spending cuts that really does protect the most vulnerable. But I think it's just really important that members of Congress understand the urgency and that these programs cannot take any further cuts. I'll turn it over to see if Leslie, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I completely agree with you.
All right. We also had a question, given the government shutdown, how accessible members of Congress are right now, and whether if folks called the offices or wrote emails, would there be anyone to hear them or open those letters? So if folks wanted to comment on that.
I think that's a great question, and I think it depends upon the office. I had read in one article that some members were answering their own phones because they didn't have staff to answer the phone. So it could be that you call a certain office and you get to speak directly with the member. I think others, especially calling the Capitol switchboard, it can be tied up, but we have heard that. So we've just heard different reports. You can also always email members of Congress as well, and I think most of our organizations have websites that a letter's already there that you can kind of alter, and then it'll go straight to your members of Congress. But again, I'll see if any of my colleagues want to add anything to that.
No, this is Leslie. I do think it depends on the office. I have some good friends who are the only staffer working in their boss's office, people who handle the budget. So I think it depends on whether or not they're in the office at that minute when you call. I would absolutely leave messages when you get the opportunity, whether it is through voicemail or a staffer picking up the phone or a member picking up the phone, of course. Also try emails. Don't worry about regular snail mail letters. They won't get through the postal irradiation system quickly enough if you want to talk about the longer-term budget impacts, you could probably send a paper letter, but it does take about 4 weeks for mail to be irradiated and get through the security screening system on the Capitol, at the Capitol complex. But again, just keep trying and use that 800 number that Howie had up. Maybe we could go back to that slide, John. Sorry.
Okay.
And I think it's worth pointing out that we have a number of coalition partners, both in and outside the faith community, that are engaging in call-in days today through Friday. So you will be in good company when you make your phone call.
And this is John, as someone who was actually Hill staff during the last large and long government shutdown. I think Amelia's point is great that that we were all picking up the phones, including the member of Congress, and so it is a way to get through the filter and get your message right to the policymaker and the key staff. So definitely give it a try. And there is the Capitol switchboard number that will take you right to your member. So we're right at an hour. The last slide, which I will attempt to go back to, has all of our email addresses. So if you have further questions or follow-up, please feel free to contact any of us. If you had questions about SNAP, you can contact Christine or really any of us, because we work on all of these issues. I appreciate all of y'all's patience with our technology and the temporary audio shutdown. And Rabbi, are you still with us to offer a closing prayer, Rabbi Tkowski?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. And thank you to our presenters for really sharing their wisdom with us and for helping us navigate the rocky waters where we find ourselves these days. And we certainly all hope that this current difficulty will end. But as a thought, I have to tell you that, as a relative newcomer to the legislative world of D.C., it's very easy to lose ourselves, or for me to lose myself at the very least, in the details of legislation, important details, and the acronyms and the numbers and exactly how everything works. And it is vital, I think, for all of us to remember why we're doing this, to remember what this is all about. So for me, that idea comes at the very, very beginning of the Bible, in the story of creation, in two very short phrases. One, God says near the end of chapter 1, or the Bible says, "And God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." The idea that each human being is made in the image of God, that no matter race, religion, orientation, no matter where we live, each person has something inside of him or herself that is not from this earth, that is from God, and therefore should be guaranteed certain rights, certain dignity that we are all fighting for. The second idea is really for us, for those who are working, who are fighting the good fight, from the story of Cain and Abel, when after Cain kills his brother, God says, from the story of Adam and Eve, when they're hiding from God, and God says, in Hebrew, it's very stark, one word, ayeka, which is translated as, "Where are you?" Now, we all know God doesn't need to ask where people are. God knows everything. So what does God mean by saying, "Where are you?" God is really asking, what kind of person are you? Where are you when trouble is on the earth? Where are you when your fellow human beings are struggling? Maybe God is saying, I put you there to do this work, and who are you to run away from it? So as a final note, I just want to share with you this tradition that gives me strength when I am frustrated, when I feel that the problems around me are too big to ever solve, that I'm frustrated by the structure, the framework I find myself in, and that's, I'm sure, a frustration that is not mine alone. So I'll share this teaching. It is not your responsibility to finish the job, to finish the work, but you are not free to desist from your part in it. Each one of us has holy work to do, and I hope we push aside our frustration and do everything we can to move this struggle one step at a time forward toward that goal we all hope to reach. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you all. We will stay on the line to continue to answer the few questions that continue through the chat text. Otherwise, thank you all for participating, and we will be in touch and stay connected with you as we continue this struggle.